at the moment, you may be seeing me and Andy just fervently getting everything ready for today's live stream. We've got an action-packed episode for you all and stuff as we get cracking and things. But how are we doing there, Andy?
I'm pretty good, Gandhi. Yeah, just getting the screen share ready. So, but yeah, pretty good. How about yourself?
Yeah, ticking on. Slightly refreshed because I had a week off, which is always a good thing. So I went to Disneyland, believe it or not. Magical place on earth.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Disneyland.
Yeah. Did I not tell you this?
Paris or
Paris? Yeah, Paris.
Okay. I've been to the one in America.
Very easy to do. I'd highly recommend it in terms of its ease of ability. So Eurostar to Disney and to Paris, and then Paris train to Disneyland and stuff. It's pretty good and easy to do, and I had a great time.
Yeah, I've done Disney World in Florida, and it just absolutely blew my mind in terms of how good a theme park could be. So much better than Alton Towers and our UK-based theme parks, I thought.
But yeah, but it ain't cheap. That's the only downside. It does cost a lot.
No, that's true. Yeah, and the merchandise game is excellent in terms of the merchandise available in the Disney parks. Yeah, that's a universal...
You did a blog about that, didn't you? In terms of how potentially we could use Disneyland experience for NHS care and stuff.
Yeah, that was in my younger, more naive and optimistic days. Although it's a really interesting organization, actually, like Disney Corporation. Like, they're really, really effective at what they do. So I still would say that there's lessons to be learned, but quite how easy those lessons are to implement now, that's a different story.
Yeah. Right. Well, we sidetracked onto Disney. We can absolutely talk about it if you want, EGP learners, as you join us live. But we're going to get cracking now as we talk about today's episode with so much updates that you are going to be bowled over by what's been happening in general practice since we've been away in Disney and other things and stuff. So shall we get cracking?
Let's go.
Lots of changes happen in general practice over the past couple of weeks. And in this episode, myself and Andy are going to talk about key things that have happened, including a letter from the GPC to West Streeting, which is setting out some key tones, the medium-term guidance for the NHS, which is going to tell us what the NHS is going to be doing over the next 3 years, and some system provider updates in every single provider, including one you may or may not have heard of, as we continue to tech enhance your primary care learning. Welcome each of you to this episode. Myself and Andy are going through loads and loads of updates that we've had over the past couple of weeks. In addition to talking about Disney that we were just talking about, if you joined us for the pre-section and stuff. But how are we doing there, Andy?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, raring to go. There's quite a lot to get through, and we always say that we're going to try and deliver shorter updates. So let's see how we square all of that off today.
Absolutely. So rather than go through everything in detail, we're just going to get straight into it. I think, Andy, that's probably the best way to do so. And the first thing we are going to cover is, and this is going to set the tone for some of the discussions that we've got. So the NHS have figured out that it's going to cost $3 billion to cover the strikes and various other costs that are coming to the NHS in the next few months and things. This was a key news story that came out just a couple of days ago. Tell us about it, Andy.
Yeah, so I guess the top line is that NHS Confederation and NHS health providers, so these are organisations that represent leaders in healthcare, have calculated that they need at least £3 billion in additional funding to cover some unexpected costs. So these are things from strikes, industrial actions, which haven't been anticipated in plans, redundancies, and this I imagine will include the ICB up to 50% workforce redundancies, which were mandated by the government, but I think it didn't appear that they'd allocated the cost of redundancies sort of anywhere on the balance sheet.
And the redundancies for NHS England as well. So obviously, earlier in the year, they announced the closure of NHS England in 2 years' time, but apparently have not planned for the redundancy payments that would be as a result of that closure of that organisation and stuff. So therefore, that's clearly having an impact.
And additional drug costs as well. So just interesting to highlight that despite increases in funding, healthcare is really, really expensive, and transformational change is really expensive as well, particularly if you're reshaping the workforce, and that involves removing roles. Redundancy is a big cost that you need to take into account.
Definitely. And you mentioned the drug costs. So interestingly, out of that $3 billion, half of it, 1.5 billion, is expected to be the cost of the drugs. Obviously, key ones that we know of that have definitely hit the news headlines, things like GLP-1s and that kind of stuff. Trump basically saying that he wants all of them to go to America. As a result, the cost increase for those drugs to primary care and patients here has gone significantly up. But these are significant changes in costs that are going to have an impact, and as a result, obviously takes away from that extra funding that has been announced for the NHS, that 29 billion that we heard in the previous spending reviews and stuff and things. So it will be interesting to see what impact this has and how that filters down moving forward, doesn't it, Andy?
Absolutely. So shall we move on to next story?
Yeah. So in addition to that, we've also had a news story that talks about undated resignations in general practice. So for those of you that have followed the channel, we this has always been a much talked about potential topic when it comes to collective action and various other aspects in general practice, about the concept of GPs submitting undated resignations. But what did you pick up from this article, Andy?
Yeah, so there's the England's LMC's conference in Manchester next month, I think, and obviously various LMCs from around the country proposed motions on which to vote, and those motions, I believe, go on then to inform BMA negotiating positions going forward. So that's sort of the mechanism that we're talking about here in terms of GP leaders to vote, and then undated contract resignation letters. So I think this is something that the GPs in Ireland were talking about doing a few years ago and may have actually done. So I believe this is where GPs write a letter saying that they will resign. And I'm not quite sure, how does the mechanism work with it being undated, Gandhi? Because it's not valid until it's dated, right? So is it that you have them ready and just kind of fire them off if conditions aren't met?
Yeah. So I believe this was done, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong by any of our GP learners joining us, but back in the 60s, I think it was, when there was lots of transformation post, obviously, the initial introduction of NHS. And as a result of that, lots of GPs in England submitted undated resignations to the BMA at the time. And that basically then gives the BMA a mandate to say, this is how many resignations we've got if you don't come to the negotiating table and talk to us about changes and stuff. And then the GPC then have the ability to then date them, and then obviously they would work forward from there. So it's a mechanism to try and outline the potential impact. Now, it's one of those things that only works if they get significant mass. We are talking 6,000 practices across the country in England. In terms of number of GPs, we're talking roughly about 50 to 55,000 GPs currently thought to be working in United Kingdom. So you would need a significant number to agree to that. And this is the first start of that motion. So if this gets passed through at the LMC conference, that gives the GPC a mandate to ask for undated resignations from the profession. The next question is then obviously how many GPs are willing to do it. And the key focus of this will probably focus on the partners doing this, not necessarily the salaries and the locums, because they can't do it in the same way.
Absolutely. I think we're talking about resignation from GMS contract delivery by partners rather than salary GPs resigning from their positions within partnerships or other organizations. It's interesting. And I guess the GP provider landscape is a little bit different to it was in the 60s. There are more additional organizations and organization types that can deliver GP services. I don't know whether you think that dilutes this a little bit. Could Department of Health turn around and say, that's fine, we'll re-employ your staff and deliver this through hospital trusts or kind of other organizations that are now capable of delivering contracts? Or do you think there's still
I think it's a
critical mass of partners that it would just be too huge an upset to be able to sort of practically solve? I don't know. What do you think, Andy?
I think my understanding of the current landscape, there's still significantly more GMS, GP partners, than there are other models of general practice. So I think the likelihood is the numbers still very much favour the GP partnership model to do that. You're right, it is different to the 60s, and it's definitely different to the last significant GP contract negotiation, which was the 2004 GP contract, which obviously allowed the changeover of out of hours being handed back to the NHS to manage rather than the practice and stuff. But I still think the numbers wise, it's, I mentioned 50,000 GPs. You don't need 50,000. You don't even need half of that. I think you probably need about 10,000 GPs to say that they wanted to do that, and not even that realistically, maybe less. The key thing, it'll be particular partners, interestingly, that'll be the key voice, because you will have some partnerships that cover a considerable number of patients, and actually it's the impact it has on patients that potentially has the likelihood here. So the single-handed GP that wants to do this, covers 3,000-4,000 patients, will unfortunately have potentially less value to those much larger partnerships that are run by 3, 5, 10 partners that cover populations of 20 to 50,000 patients. Those will be the ones that are the ones that would be interesting to see whether or not they are willing, because that is significant liability that those GP partners are taking on. They're saying we're going to give up risking our livelihood, which, let's be honest, that is the concept of strikes. You are saying that you're going to stop working. So it's not, an unexpected thing to do, but it is a significant ask for those partners to take. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, this is not something that will be for the salaried GPs and the locums, which is the majority of the current workforce. This will be the partners that have to make that decision.
Yeah, and of course, it is very different to striking as well,
Yeah.
because that's an area of law, I believe, where provided it's a sort of sanctioned strike organised through your union, you have certain protections there. Whereas if you resign from your contract and they accept that, then that's it. Contract's gone, and you might have staff to be made redundant. You might have bills to pay and continue to pay your lease on premises that you might be committed to lease for a number of years in the future. The landscape is really different to how it was in the 60s, and I think partners will have to really carefully think about what risk they're undertaking in terms of submitting these letters. The premises landscape is really, really different as well. Part of how this would be impactful is actually it takes premises and estate that is owned by partners off the table if they own their own buildings. But of course, a lot of buildings aren't owned by partners anymore, and they're leased, and arrangements could be made to bring them back into service to deliver care outside of the GMS partnership contract. Gosh, well, this could get really, really complicated. Nonetheless, it's something that will be voted on, and I think that we ought to revisit this and see if that vote goes through, and what the kind of feeling and sentiment is around this. People are obviously watching out there. Some people might be partners, some people might be salaried GPs. Be really interested to know how people feel about whether they'd send an undated letter to the BMA to use as leverage.
Yeah. So you know what, Andy, I'm going to ask that in the chat. So if you are watching us live, would you submit an undated resignation if the GPC asked for it? So if you're watching us live, let us know. I'm going to try and put a poll in to allow that to happen on the YouTube side of things. So just give me a second to do that. This is off the cuff. This is live. This is literally happening as we talk about it. So I will do that whilst Andy goes to the next topic that we're going to talk about, which is a bit more meaty, isn't it, Andy?
Yeah, well, this is another letter. So Wes Streeting and Stephen Kinnock and Kate Obama-Stainer and the BMA have been exchanging quite a lot of letters over the past few months, and the tone's been pretty frosty in places. That relationship does not, on the face of it, appear to be in a good place. And we spoke at our last update about Stephen Kinnock's speech to the RCGP conference, and some elements of that did not go down well at all. So this is the latest letter in that kind of ongoing saga. And this is from the 29th of October, and this is to Wes Streeting, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and it's from the GPC and signed by Katie Bramall-Stainer. And it essentially, the bits that are interesting to me is it actually sets out what I think is some of the BMA's negotiating position.
Very much so.
Contract negotiations, those come a little bit later in the letter. So I think it's quite interesting from that perspective. I think you can divine a little bit about what they want. And then after we've gone through it, Gandhi, I'm interested to know what you think everyone is up to with these letters and what's happening. Because I've had some thoughts myself. So just to pick out some key statements. So yeah, I mean, the purpose of this letter is out there from the beginning, setting the profession's expectations.
Do you mind just zooming in a little bit, Andy?
Oh yeah. So first statement is the purpose of this letter is to set expectations for the upcoming negotiations. So she's been really clear about what that is. That's too close. We'll have to go out a little bit. There we go. And she's saying they've agreed to negotiate in good faith. That was contingent upon 3 conditions. And he said all 3 of those conditions have not been or have yet to be met. And then she highlights those 3 conditions which she believes have not been met by Department of Health. So one was around the online consultation tools, and the Department of Health and Social Care had said that they would work with GPs and system providers to make sure that there were safeguards in place to prevent urgent issues being submitted alongside routine ones and the risks to patients that entails. And she says that that has not happened yet. Point 2, the Department of Health and Social Care were going to work with them to ensure that technical and governance standards are met for GP Connect update. So update records. So Gandhi, you're better at articulating this, but there was another contract update to mandate that GPs opened up some of the access to the GP record and data to allow data to be written into GP records from other providers, and that with GPs being the data controllers and having considerable responsibilities to the Information Commissioner's Office and about the governance of that data, that placed GPs in quite a difficult position. I don't know, can you explain that a little bit better than I am doing, Andy?
Well, yeah, effectively. So GP update record allows other providers to put information into the GP records that potentially can bypass safeguards of the practice being able to verify or vet them. And there's that question then, as GPs being the data controller, and they are meant to have responsibility of that information, how does that bypass that those requirements? What if there's complaints? What if there's issues, right of correction, etc.? Various aspects about GDPR and other aspects of data access that come into play here. So the GPC, quite rightly, in my view, said to the government that this requires some level of extra consideration. You can't just switch this on and let this happen automatically. Government have felt different. They feel that this is a requirement because it allows other services to play better with a unified record, making the GP record that unified record across healthcare systems, which absolutely in some ways plays well for the benefit of patients and healthcare longer term. But the question then comes, if the GP is the data controller and there is an issue or liability that comes from that data, they are now potentially responsible for that. Now, we don't have a test case to prove that yet. That's what nobody wants to be. One of the later asks is about changing the indemnity cover to allow that to be included, which at the moment it is not. And that, I think, is the key requirement. If NHS England were to allow that to be part of the CNSGP cover for data governance, actually a lot of those risks are modified on that basis because it removes some of the financial liability, particularly since the GP practices themselves don't have control of that. But again, NHS England have not conceded in that aspect. And I think quite rightly because they know that this is an element of uncertainty in terms of data governance. And actually, they don't want to have those costs come to the NHS itself. They want those costs to remain within GP practices. Is that a mechanism to drive problems down the line? Well, skepticism and cynicism come into play here, don't they, Andy?
Yeah, so you explained that really, really well, Gandhi, and you've just indicated that later in the letter it sets out some of the requirements, and that's one of them. And point 3 was they'd agreed to work in good faith with the GPC of the BMA to negotiate substantive new GMF practice contract by the end of the lifetime of the partnership. It was end of the lifetime of the current Parliament, and BMA note that they're worried that this is not proceeding as planned and that the government may not be acting in good faith because a review of the Carhill formula funding model, which we've discussed before. So a review of the way GP practices core funding is allocated has started, and the BMA don't feel that they're being appropriately involved so far in those discussions and negotiations around that. And then they also highlight that in the 10-year plan, there were 2 new types of contract discussed. That's the small neighbourhood provider and the multi-neighbourhood provider, which are really, really relevant to general practice. And I think they felt a bit blindsided by that, is my interpretation. So they're concerned that those negotiations towards the new contracts may not be proceeding in good faith. with us so far, Gandhi?
Yep, definitely still there. And then I think we go into the asks, don't we, specifically?
Yeah, well, they throw in something which is like bullet point 4 after the 3 things that they feel indicate that they're not proceeding and negotiating in good faith. And so they kind of throw in a bit of an extra one here in the middle. So they say that there was a resolution from the GPC in July indicating that they felt that an increase in £50 to the weighted funding per patient per year was necessary to meet additional costs and catch up for lost increases in funding. So where funding hadn't kept pace with inflation and other costs, they felt that £50 extra was necessary to get the funding that patients receive to their general practice or for their GP care back to where it ought to be if those things have been taken into account. And then they reflect that in Scotland, and this was something that happened in the last few weeks, wasn't it? There was a resolution to these discussions in Scotland, and there was an uplift to the core contract in Scotland of about £41, £42 to reflect these cost increases and to stabilize general practice. So they've kind of thrown that as an extra one, I think, saying actually we believe that general practice needs something similar to what happened in Scotland to return funding to where it should be. So, and then there's some graphs to sort
of. And importantly, they provided the graphs that back that up as well. So if you wanted that visualization of the information, if the core contract increases had kept pace with things like inflation and various other aspects, actually, that's how much general practice should be getting to keep status with modern costs. So, this whole concept of general practice not working effectively, that's not producing enough appointments, a huge proportion of that is that the funding for general practice has not kept in line with inflation, various other aspects and things. And that's why many places don't have the capacity to provide the resources and things. So, there's good evidence behind this. And actually, if the previous governments, accepting that this was, very much previous governments' mantra and stuff, that we would have more funding, people would have more appointments. There is no contention at all.
Absolutely. So then they go into setting out. So GPC England further requires. So I think this is where they're really spelling out what their expectations are for the contract negotiations. So I guess we'll just take each one in turn, really. So written confirmation of the funding envelopes for next year's contract, together with nominal budgets for single neighbourhood and multi-neighbourhood provider contracts. So I think they want to know what money is going where. Next, confirmation of a roadmap regarding timelines and nominal budgets for commitment to GMS contract renewal and investment within this Parliament. So how you've said that we're going to renegotiate a new contract within this Parliament, but what's the roadmap? Because that could go up to 2030, without any action. So they want to know what's happening to budgets within that timeline, and when is that contract negotiation coming? Were you about to say something, Andy?
No, go for it.
Let's keep going. Okay. Next, transfer of primary care network DES services. So that's the additional roles reimbursement scheme of the primary care network DES. Monies to practice level reimbursements where this is requested by the PCN. So there's been a long running ask from the BMA to potentially wrap primary care network staff funding into core contract funding. So that's what they are asking for again. Next, agreement on an additional emergency GP practice level reimbursement scheme to end GP underemployment, allowing practices to utilise every available GP in England. So that's action on the and underemployed GP issue. So lots of GPs out there not employed to the extent that they want, not getting the hours per week that they feel that they could deliver and give to patient care, and some sadly being unemployed as well at times. And finally, extension of the clinical negligence scheme for general practice to cover liabilities pertaining to data sharing and information governance for the GP patient record, which you alluded to before. And I think this is actually potentially quite a big one. And actually, if this were to be done, that might unblock some of the resistance that the Department of Health gets to its kind of data sharing and digital ambitions from general practice. And that resistance is there in response to the weight of legal responsibility with big financial penalties if things are not handled correctly that GPs currently bear as data controllers for the GP for the GP data that they hold. So potentially quite a big one, because if you can remove that liability, then actually GPs may be or may feel that they have more flexibility to agree to some of the things that are being asked in terms of data sharing.
And there is this aspect that is actually the NHS, the data control for general practice anyway, because unilaterally, the government are able to make changes that require practices to then share data that they are not happy in the guidance of, ICO and GDPR and various other data regulations to actually share. So, absolutely the liability then should sit with an organization that's making those decisions contractually versus the organizations that are being asked to manage it. Because you could argue that is the practice of the data controller or now becoming the data processor who wouldn't have the liability in the same way because of the fact the government are making these changes. So Wes Streeting, Steve Kinnock, if you are watching this, which would be awesome if you did, and first thing, you've always got an open invite to come and join myself and Andy on the channel to do so. But yeah, this is a good way to deal with a lot of the resistance, as Andy mentioned, in terms of the hesitation about data governance, which may help drive forward so much more of the digital agenda, the change with the NHS app and various other data aspects and patient information flows. This, for me, like you said, Andy, is a good win for the government if they did it. But clearly, they don't want to do it for some reason. And I think that's because they know what they're doing puts them in a risky situation for liability. And they'd rather have that liability with practices.
I think so. Or they're asking for things to happen which need quite a lot of work to then mitigate the liabilities. So it's fine. So, okay, we want people outside of the practice to be able to write into the GP record. But then obviously there's an issue around patients having the right to view that record. And actually there are certain types of data that need redacting from that view that the patients have in order to meet requirements from the ICOs, which is third-party information. So third-party information might go in from another provider, but if actually you're allowing that in, then it's then work that the GP surgery has to do to make sure that there's nothing in there that needs to be redacted to comply with the ICO's rules in order to avoid the fines. It's about work here, I think.
So maybe an example might help here, Andy. So just to give it an idea to those who don't understand the data governance regulations and stuff and things, under the current requirements now by NHS England that they have put through, for example, if a patient was to go to a pharmacy for a pharmacy first service and the pharmacy documented that consultation but inputted, for example, the wrong patient's details, okay, maybe they saw parent and child, and they put the child's details in the parent's records. Under the current premise, that information will go straight into the GP record for the wrong patient. That would be the incorrect data. Later down the line, the parent, for example, could say, this isn't my information, this is incorrect. And based on that information, maybe a prescribing decision was made because different medications were issued, etc. An error occurred. Under the current basis, that information would be in the record without the practice knowing, because it hasn't triggered something that alerts that to be a system issue. And the liability would now be on the practice as data controller in terms of the financial issues of that data being incorrect, let alone the clinical output of that, if that was to then have an impact in the clinical decision making. And this is why practices are really struggling with this, because that seems to go against a lot of the data governance guidance that we currently have as to how data governance should work.
And in order to mitigate that risk, you either don't allow the access for that information to be written in from the pharmacy, or you have to do additional work to review that information,
which is not funded. Yeah,
and I think this is about liability. I also think this is about work as well, and making people do work. So anyway, there are then just some final asks, which again I think give a bit of a window on the GPC's kind of negotiating position with regards to contracts. So dedicated funding package to upgrade GP infrastructure, and this must go beyond clinical rooms to other things like kitchens and staff zones and so forth. So I think that's actually reasonable. Aesthetics is a big issue, and it's not just about clinical rooms. There are other things as well, staff toilets, all sorts of things. If you're increasing the size of the estate significantly, expansion of the SFE locum reimbursement scheme to uplift by CPI, annually. I think, linking some of these reimbursements to CPI are really, really sensible, so that they go up automatically, avoid some of that kind of funding deficit that accrues over years that we discussed previously. Development of a comprehensive nationally agreed safeguarding DES to include medical reports requested by probation and fostering services. So I think that's about payment for work that currently is not funded when providing information for sort of safeguarding investigations and similar activities. Penultimately, uplifting Schedule 1 vaccinations annually by CPI. So again, linking some of those reimbursements to inflation to avoid accruing, big underfunded positions over years. And finally, fully funded practice IT and EPS for dispensing practices. So,
which is a no-brainer. If you want to have a digital agenda, you need to provide general practice with the tools to allow it to do that.
So, Gandhi,
anyway,
right. So hopefully that's a window on GPC negotiating position, which I think is why the letter is quite interesting. Just like, what do you think's what's going right? A lot of frosty letters going back and forth. What can we read into this? Kind of zooming back, and what do you think's going on? Have you got any thoughts, Gandhi? I've got a few.
I think this is an argument in the public domain because they want to try and shape what the potential next contract might start to look like. And I think there's very much an aspect from the government that they've got a bill of an amount of money that they can spend, and they have no intention of going anywhere over that at all. Whereas general practice, quite rightly, is saying you're asking general practice to be the workhorse of the NHS. You're asking us to provide more services for less, quicker, and at the point of access without any kind of question. We're going to come into some of the detail that comes into play with that. So I think it's very much people potentially trying to set out what the negotiations are looking like. But the question is, are they actually negotiating, or are they negotiating in the public sphere with a view for setting the tone for the actual discussions? That's my thought. Love to know what you think, Andy.
So very similarly, I was thinking, like, why are we seeing all of this, right? Because quite often these sorts of things are negotiated privately. I guess general practice kind of wants to know what the GPC's positions are, there needs to be a conversation within the profession about what we want. So I think it's potentially serving that function. The tone's really frosty, isn't it, between these two?
It's changed. Before, if you go back to April, it was almost complimentary, you could argue, to some degree. And it sounds like there's been absolutely a breakdown between the two.
Yeah, so I think that's unfortunate. I wonder if that tone is reflected privately, because sometimes these things can be performative, can't they? Maybe Wes and Katie get on better when they sit down and talk, without too many other people there, because sometimes there's an element of being performative for your audience. Wes needs to look like he's being hard on professions and towing a strict line in terms of those kind of funding red lines, I guess, for the government. And Katie needs to appear tough for many in the profession who take a hard line. So part of me just went, is this performative or not? I've got a feeling perhaps it isn't, because it does seem genuinely frosty. But that's one of the things that I was thinking. And then I was also thinking about our old friend Overton's window, which we talk about a lot in terms of shaping a discussion. A tactic apparently is to use Overton's window, where maybe the outcome that you want is sort of just to the right of reasonable, but you say something that is like really far out, much further to the right, to shift public opinion, to shift the expectations of who you're negotiating with. And then when you offer something that's a little bit closer to the center and maybe closer to what you really want, it's more palatable to everybody. So I wonder if both sides are kind of playing around with Overton's window here as well. And
maybe
the resolution that we see will
be
closer to each other.
On that matter, let's go to some of the comments that we've had. So one from Royce Chan talking about regarding the vote. And then so that, just to clarify, this is, I'm assuming, about the vote for undated resignations. I think it'd be tough to ask any partner without plans. And he clarifies it's not replicating, it replacing loss of earnings through other allowable activity for short-term, long-term gain. I agree with you, Royce. I'm also going to put some challenge to general practice here. The point of striking is to actually say you're going to withdraw services and the consequences of that. And I'm going to go back to our, resident doctors when they've been striking and stuff. I've had situations with some trainees who have not understood that the whole point of striking is saying you're withholding services and that you are taking that potential risk of financial liability and then having that risk subsequently down the line by having extensions of training and stuff because they've stroked for so many days and not realizing that that is the actual consequence of what you're suggesting to do. That is going to be the same for general practice. You're right. It's people's livelihoods. It's, the mortgages, the various other staffing costs, liability for their staff and things. But it is the worst case scenario of what you're willing to do in order to have a contract that means you can continue to function, or so you keep working like a workhorse effectively. That is the alternative aspects and stuff. So it is a challenging perspective, but I'm also going to put some challenge there to general practice that, it is the worst case scenario. Are you willing to go to the worst case scenario to have a potential for a better future? Don't know your thoughts on that one, Andy.
Well, I'm going to sort of push back at your position slightly, Gandhi, and say,
go for it. I'm happy to be pushed back
again. This isn't the same as striking, right? Because you have protection. If you do a properly agreed strike, your job's actually protected. You're not necessarily breaking your contract in a way where you'll get sacked. What this is about is say, oh, I'm resigning from this contract. So for many GP partners, that might mean, I have to pay to make my staff redundant potentially. I might know that I've signed a 7-year lease on a big medical center and I have to pay a few £1 million over that 7 years for the lease, and I can't get out of the lease. That's gonna just absolutely bankrupt. Personally bankrupt some people. That lose their houses, that lose their cars. The impact on their family would be enormous. So let's not underestimate what is potentially being asked of GP partners here. And I think it's important that salary.
Absolutely agree with you, Andy. I'm not underestimating that at all.
That. I don't think you are, but I'm just providing the pushback just so that people out there understand what's potentially at stake for partners and why it's actually quite a difficult ask.
And that is a challenging situation we end up in terms of the fact that, GP partnerships are a very unique contractual mechanism that a lot of people don't understand. Interestingly, one of the news stories we're not covering is the supposed thing about the NI increases to LLP partnerships that's being potentially cascaded for the next budget, which, if happens in the way that it sounds like, potentially had extra costs for GP partners, particularly because it's targeted at LLP and other partnerships they're suggesting, which would also include GP.
I need to have a closer look at that, because obviously GP partnerships generally aren't LLP partnerships,
No.
which accountants and lawyers are. And I noticed some of the earlier headlines said, oh, accountants, lawyers and doctors. And then later on, it's about accountants and lawyers. I think there are LLP partnerships out there delivering healthcare, but I think some of them are like more private providers, not necessarily delivering government contracts. I think it's difficult to hold those if you're structured as an LLP currently. I know we looked at, should we become an LLP a few years ago, and actually hard to hold the contract, or you can't automatically transfer your GMS contract to the LLP without.
And I believe the biggest issue with that is the NHS pension. This is the one that stops a lot of people from going down that route. It stops you from being able to enroll in the NHS pension, which is obviously one of the key benefits for working for the NHS itself, even though apparently general practice doesn't work for the NHS, supposedly. Anyway, moving on to a quick other comment, and I am going to mention this one in particular. So shout out to Ammar Ahmed. I'm assuming that's the Ammar Ahmed I know of, and going to talk about, and we're going to see in a second on the channel. So just to mention that. So he's suggesting maybe the GPC have been played. Potentially, there has been some questions about how the GPC have handled these contract negotiations and stuff. So he's then mentioned, was the profession marched to the top of the hill, collective action from last year in particular, and marched back down with the leadership behaved naively and believing the promises? It's a question that I think is fair to ask of the leadership and stuff. And I know many people have asked that question in the public sphere. I think the LMC England conference will be a turning point, hopefully, to see some change in things. It will be interesting to see how that looks and where that works from there. But we need to get cracking, don't we, Andy? Because we have a habit of saying we're going to be quick, and we're not being quick today. So just before we carry on with the next section, we are going to do our lovely little game that we've got. I'm just trying to find it. Where is it got? On our wavelength. There we go. So this is
I enjoy this. Yeah. Other people can see if they're on your wavelength as well. Gandhi. So.
Yeah. So, okay, we're going to set the tone. We'll go back to the answers to this later on. So this is the wavelength board spectrum. I'm going to give Andy a clue. He has to figure out where it is on that stake. So let's just spin this round. There we go. Let's just do that because otherwise that's possible. Okay, closing it. Okay, so Andy, we've got, here we are. Okay, so administrative on this side of the spectrum, clinical on this side. So I'm going to give Andy a quick clue that helps him try and figure out if he's on my wavelength in terms of where on this spectrum that may sit. Going to see how many points he gets. If you're joining us online, they can do the same, put in the coordinates. So this would be 0 degrees, and this is technically 175 degrees or something like that and stuff. So remember, administrative this side, clinical this side. I'm going to go for this is the bit we don't factor into the time. That's the part I need to think, isn't it? So let's go for booking an appointment for a smear test.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm going to change that. Booking an appointment for a blood test.
Oh, okay. Let's go 0. Oh no, let's go. No, let's go 10. 10. 10.
10.
You know.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So YouTube learners, if you're watching us live, let us know in the comments where you think that would fit in terms of the spectrum. We're going to come back to this at the end of the episode and see whether or not Andy's got it right and whether you've got it right if you're joining us live and stuff. And Amar, if you're still watching us, I challenge you to join this game as well. So, right, next up, we're going to talk about some significant changes that have come through when it comes to system providers. So there are some EPR, electronic patient record providers in general practice. And in the past week, we have had 3 things happen that actually cover every current major provider for systems in general practice. So we're going to go through those really quickly now, aren't we, Andy?
We are. And in fact, you're going to lead us through it, Gandhi. This is more your area of expertise. So tell me now, I'll ask you some questions if they occur.
Yeah, so first off, we had the first public demonstration of Medicus. So this is the new electronic record system for general practice that's currently available in the UK, in England and stuff for people to utilize. I mentioned Amar Ahmed. I'm hoping it's the same Amar that's joining us, that has actually been on this live stream. So if you go through it, you can actually see him in the middle of that screen there, Andy, in the scrubs. That's Amar. I believe it's the same one. And talking about the introduction of Medicus. So this is, like I said, a new electronic system. Currently, we have had for several years the duopoly, as it's called, between EMIS and TPP System 1. And this is a potentially new electronic system that people use, browser-based, potentially really interesting from looking at the live stream and stuff. And basically they're showing what it can do. So friends of the channel, Amar Ahmed, Dave Triska is in there in the top right corner as well. You can see Dave, who's just gone live with it, I believe about a month or so ago as well, and showcasing what the potential is from this system. And I think there's been a lot of interest generated before that. And yes, just to confirm, Amar jumping in saying yes. Oh no, there we are. Yes, it's me. So there you go. So we will put the link to that. Andy's already put it in the chat for those who want to look at it and stuff. You can go have a look at this live stream. I watched it live. I was going to do a reaction video, but just not had the time. But it looks pretty interesting and clearly deals with some aspects. Amar's definitely a big fan of it, as you will watch if you watch the live stream and stuff. And yeah, just to mention that this is now something that is an option for people who want to look at it and things. I think there are going to be other players coming to the market shortly as well, from my understanding. The Medicus are definitely one of the newer entrances we've been talking about for quite a while on the channel when it comes to electronic medical records for general practice, and maybe worth a little look and stuff and things from there. That's story number 1. Shall we go to story number 2, Andy?
Story number 2. So Blackstone among suitors for United Health owned Optum UK. So what's going on here, Gandhi?
So some EGP may remember a couple of years or so ago, the company Optum, which is owned by United Health, one of the largest medical providers in America, bought out EMIS, which is, as we've just mentioned, one of the 2 major electronic record providers for England and UK and things. And it looks like that the shareholders of United Health have kind of thought we're redressing. So United Health has quite some significant problems in America, in particular in terms of how they're managing healthcare. Very much insurance-based mechanism, thought to be, a little bit not great in terms of how they're doing things, and as a result of that, having to reevaluate some of their assets. And they've had a suggestion of potentially selling the EMIS system, the Optum-owned part of it, to a new company. It was Black. I've forgotten the name now.
It's Blackstone. So they're like
Blackstone.
a massive. They might even be the world's biggest like investor in private equity, I think. So that's where something, I guess, is not a publicly traded company and is owned privately. So I think they deal with private equity, hedge funds, things like that. So really, really big investor, I guess. Don't know which
I
way.
think the interesting thing about this is that. Yeah, so I remember when we covered, United Health and Optum buying out EMIS, that it was sold for 1.2 billion. It was the largest general practice transaction at that time. I think it's still probably the largest general practice acquisition that ever happened. And as a result of that, there was this thought that would there be investment into the product, that kind of stuff. Some would argue that investment doesn't appear to have materialized in the same way people were hoping for. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we've got the rise of things like Medicus and stuff. And, Amar, I'm sure, would jump in on there if he wanted to in terms of talking about things and stuff. But I think, there is this concept of, has that had an additional impact in the reliability of EMIS and various, aspects that it has that's led to this change? Possibly. I don't know. That's probably a discussion for another time and things. But it is a significant potential change.
Yeah, ownership's always a significant potential change, and I guess maybe with considering, like, it's not always that, like, when a company decides to sell something, it's because it's underperforming. Sometimes if their core business is having difficulties, they just want to refocus on core business, and there might be like profitable other things that are not aligned with core business that they want to offload to generate money to support the core business. So it's not necessarily reflecting badly on EMIS or Optum, but it's a big change for them.
It is very much so. And if we're talking about change of ownership, I guess one of the other things we need to talk about is the third system provider, which is TPP System 1, which there has been a change. This was reported by Digital Health. So Frank Hester, the founder and CEO of TPO, is now listed only as founder of TPP, having been removed from Companies House listings of TPP System 1. So some people may or may not have seen some of the news stories around this in terms of aspects that had an impact last year, in particular some of the actions that Frank was alleged to have taken. And, as a result of that, he has now been removed from company. Now, what does that mean? No idea. We're not going to comment on that. We don't have the information to comment on that. But since we're covering the system providers, we wanted to find a news story for each one. And this is the one we found about TPP that was, I think, relevant in terms of
I think this is interesting, right? So we use the word like remove, but it just means his name's like no longer, on a document. Like, so someone's removed his name, but it doesn't mean there's been some kind of revolt or something, or that he's been removed for any negative reasons. It could just be that he's sort of stepping back to spend time with family, enjoy the, I guess the success, and wealth, I guess, that's generated. So reaches a certain stage in life. Who knows? Could he be stepping back because TPP's ownership is about to change? Like, who knows? But it's interesting. I think we'll just have to watch this space to see if this, if anything, more significant materializes following this. I guess, could there be a change of direction? Now that there's a change of chief executive. Let's watch this space. Gandhi, did TPP did they ever get bought? I can't remember. It looked like people were buying up a lot of these systems. Did they ever get a big backer or?
Not as far as I'm aware of. They're not, you can't invest in that way. They're not publicly traded companies, as far as my knowledge says. And as far as I'm aware, they've not been bought by anybody. So they're still owned potentially by Frank Hester. So
I guess people can always buy them, but I guess they're not listed. So they've got a lot more control over whether they're bought and sold, I guess.
Yeah.
Well.
So our final news story before we get to the results of it on our wavelength is the medium-term guidance for the NHS. So this hit the news headlines, and given that we're at 49 minutes already, what me and Andy are going to do is just very briefly cover the introduction of this document, and then subsequently next time you're going to have an episode from us that goes into this in much more detail, because actually this is a significant document. Probably not as significant as the 10-year health plan, but this may be this supposed delivery plan that we were hearing about in terms of what does the 10-year health plan look like and things. So we're just going to bring that on briefly and go through the medium-term planning framework, as it's called. And as you can see, this sets out the tone for 2026-27 to 2028-29, so 3 years worth of content, drive and direction for the NHS. What were your thoughts on reading the intro, Andy?
Yeah, it might be worth just saying what it is and looking at the context page, really. So the document says that it follows the 10-year plan and provides some of the detail in terms of how this is going to be delivered, which is good. They sort of say we're moving away from short-termism. And I thought, does that mean we're going to have a long-term plan? But no, it's medium-termism.
We've already got a long-term plan.
So we've got a medium-term plan now, which is kind of in the middle. So just filling that gap. So, okay, great. And then I always find the contents pages really, really helpful when picking up these documents, just to understand what's going on. So when we do go into the document in our sort of deeper dive episode, we'll be looking at the introduction and forward, which we might have a little bit of a reflection on now. And then they talk about it's sort of 4 sections, really. So 1 sets the scene. 2 is about resetting the foundations of the new operating model. So that talks about some of the contracting changes, and it talks about some of the different layers of the system and what they will look like and what roles they will have in the new environment. So it's actually really, really interesting. And then it talks about how that relates to some of the 3 shifts, hospital community, sickness to prevention, and analog to digital. And then that theme of genomics is in there as well, which I always find interesting, but it's there. Then they talk in section 3. I guess you've had a closer look at that. What's in section 3, Gandhi? People can look forward to hearing about in the deeper dive.
So it talks more about the operational aspects, of the specific asks that it's going to make in terms of the different providers and different aspects of how they're going to do that. Particularly, there's a section there for primary care, which interestingly is GP light, to be honest. So there's your sneak peek to watch that part. So section 3 is definitely the one to look at. Although there is one big ask in there that many people have talked about, which we're probably going to cover in a second because it's on one of the headline topics and things. But yeah.
And the section 4 just sets out sort of timescales in terms of planning and submission, and kind of really makes it clear that the real intended audience, or the people that must read and respond to this document, are the ICBs. It gives them their timescales in terms of responding to this plan and what they need to do to create these medium-term plans for the Department of Health. So anything to take away from the foreword or introduction, Gandhi? So you're probably going to talk about the 90% of
so again, it sets out some of the tone. It talks about the spending review, and it makes reference to this a couple of times. SR25 it's being called, and how it sets out the funding for the next 3 to 4 years. The 29 billion we talked about earlier in the episode, how that's the extra investment and how they plan to recoup the benefits of that particular investment. And then later on, it talks about these key aspects in the introduction. So just before we go to the introduction, important to recognise the people that have written and signed off this document. If you just go up a little bit, Wes Streeting and Jim Mackey. So these are the head people currently in charge of what is deriving NHS. So obviously Wes Streeting is the Secretary of State, and Jim Mackey is Chief Executive for NHS England, whilst it's still there and things. So, this is a significant document. There is no question on that. And like Andy mentioned, this is direction to the ICBs, but I think general practice should take note of this for a couple of the aspects. So it talks about some key areas that there's plans in the introduction. And if you wanted the headlines, absolutely, this is it. So it talks about elective care, doesn't it, Andy? 3 asks in particular.
These are kind of the key kind of where it sets out some aims or things that it thinks need to change, or that are part of this medium-term plan. So there are some aspirations around elective cancer care and diagnostics. There are aspirations around urgent and emergency care. It looks like a return of the 4-hour waiting target in A&E departments.
Interesting on that one. So Andy and I, when we were talking about this, I had to ask him, Andy, do you know what UEC stands for? And Andy knew because he's involved in different arenas than I am, but I didn't. And it doesn't actually specify what UEC is at all in this document, even though urgent and emergency care. So slight criticism there for Wes and Steve Mackey, This
I think
document
ICBs
doesn't set out
are required to have
terminology.
urgent and emergency care like boards and meetings to coordinate that part of the sector. If
Yeah.
no one's ever kind of
But
seen these
anyway,
meetings, there's generally people from like the hospitals, from primary care, from mental health, and they will discuss pressures on the system essentially. Anyway, carry on. So so
but in
there's
that, so
massive
you
sort of
mentioned
primary
the
care.
change. Sorry, Andy. So just
Yeah.
you mentioned about the change of the 4-hour wait for A&E. Some people may remember the previous targets, how A&E departments used to be ranked was based on how percentage of patients that were seen. 90% was the minimum requirement previously. 90% of patients had to be seen within 4 hours. They've set a new target, 85%. So the Tories scrapped the target because basically
No one
no one was
meeting.
making it. But Labour are bringing back a target, but interestingly, they're bringing back a lower target compared to before. So I think they recognise that it's not going to be achievable
Realistic.
at previous levels. Yeah. And then primary care. So this is the one that hit the headlines last week, and in particular, many people taken notice of, that 90% of urgent cases will be seen on the day. Now, I think reading this in a bit more detail, there's more to this that meets the eye. I don't know what your initial thoughts were on this, Andy. But
So initially you think, gosh, general practices I have to see 90% of urgent cases presenting to them.
Yeah.
But I guess the wording here is primary care, right? Which
Yeah.
that's not just general practice. And I guess it's not just GP surgeries that are responsible for meeting that target. And I do wonder if this will have something to do with new multi-neighborhood providers, integrated care organizations. So it's not necessarily something falling on the shoulders of existing GP practices, was my thought process after initially being very alarmed. I hope that it doesn't mean that. I don't know. How about yourself?
No, I'd agree with that. So I think when you read the headlines, the immediate thing you think of, oh my gosh, it says primary care, it means general practice. Actually, it doesn't say that in the document itself. We'll cover this in more detail, and I think there is more stuff that is directed at general practice. So make sure you do join us for that full deep dive episode. But then the rest of the primary care sections is talking about community pharmacy and huge changes for community pharmacy coming into play, mental health services as well, and community response. So that driving down the waiting list for patients waiting to see community services. And I'm assuming this is things like your community heart failure services, community respiratory based services, all those kind of things. Key reductions that they're looking at in the waiting times. And then separately talking about mental health and learning disabilities aspects. As you can see, there's some extra asks, particularly in terms of out of area care and various timelines and timeframes for patients being seen and things. So quite a lot of information in there. As we mentioned, we're not going to cover that in more detail today, but myself and Andy are going to record an episode where we go through this whole 40-page document for you in more detail. So for those of you who are involved in ICBs, PCNs, neighbourhoods, absolutely, this is going to be, one of those key text information you're going to need to refer to in the coming years. But even for GP partners, there is stuff in here that I personally think you need to be aware of, because this is the direction of travel that those higher level organizations are going to be coming to you to say, this is what you need to do moving forward. So, just as important the 10-year plan was for general practice, I think this is the implementation aspects that we've been waiting for. So your thoughts, Andy?
Yeah, I agree. It's always worth knowing what the rest of the system is up to, and how that's going to reflect on the expectations of yourself in practice. So, and we'll try and make it digestible. We're about to record it now, aren't we? After we close this live session, so we'll try and make it digestible and relevant for people as ever.
Speaking of which, as we head towards closing off, so we've played the on our wavelength game, and we now need to figure out where Andy was. So this was the previous plan. Andy put it there just about 10 degrees. Catherine Holland joined us, put it at 25 degrees, which I would say is probably, okay, I can't do this. I'd say, I'm trying to do this in the camera. I can't do this.
Okay.
Yeah,
probably.
Okay, now? Okay, fine. So let's find out. Just a reminder, we said this side was administrative, this side was clinical. I said book an appointment for a phlebotomy appointment. Okay, shall we see where we are? Bang on, Andy.
On your wavelength. Okay,
apologies, Catherine, you just missed out. But yeah.
Okay, good. We're on each other's wavelength still. That's good to know.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not zero because I guess this, at some point somebody needs to have made that decision that it's necessary, right? And I guess that's probably where Catherine's come from. It's just how you kind of integrate that with Gandhi's mind and convert that into a percentage that is something.
And he knows me probably a little bit better, hence why he's likely to have a better idea, hopefully. But yeah,
I mean, we're currently using AbTrace to do it, so it's like it's not even a computer just kind of makes the decision. But it is still a critical decision. But yeah, I guess we delegate.
Interestingly.
Yeah.
So, EGP learners, we hope you had a great time joining us for this episode. As we said, we're going to cover that medium-term guidance, and if you want to check out that information, then have a look right here, because that episode will be coming up shortly once we've recorded it. Alternatively, if you want to check out more information, particularly our AVT guide that we covered just a couple of days ago, if you're looking at AVT in general practice, that's ambient voice technology, check out here. And as ever, we'll be here to take and answer your primary care